Beneath dense forests and rolling hills, the earth hides twisting subterranean tunnels where light barely reaches, and silence weighs heavily. These hidden passages have claimed explorers who sought to chart their labyrinthine depths, turning curiosity into peril in the span of their heartbeat. From the narrow vertical shafts of Peak Cavern in Derbyshire to the fragile crystal-lined chambers of Lechuguilla, the risks of caving are relentless, unforgiving, and often invisible until it is too late. As you follow the story of those who faced these subterranean challenges, you will trace the steps of adventurers wedged in impossibly tight passages, trapped in intricate caves, and isolated beneath unfamiliar rock. You will experience the claustrophobic tension of vertical shafts, the fragile beauty of crystalline formations, and the silent, patient danger that transforms exploration into tragedy. Each passage carries a story of endurance, human limitation, and the immutable power of the earth itself. America watches a man die underground, the Floyd Collins disaster. Long before social media or instant news alerts, there was a story that gripped the United States like a slow-burning fever, a tragedy so raw that crowds gathered at the mouth of a hole in the Kentucky earth to watch men try to pull another human being out of the dark. William Floyd Collins had spent much of his life beneath the surface, slipping through underground caverns and narrow passageways in the limestone ridges of south-central Kentucky, chasing discoveries that might finally bring success after years of struggle during the era known as the Kentucky Cave Wars. It was here, in January of 1925, that Collins vanished into a narrow crawlway of sand cave, only to have a rock fall against him and pin his ankle in place, setting in motion a rescue effort that would last more than 2 weeks and transform a private plight into a national obsession. Collins was born on June 20th, 1887, in Edmonson County, Kentucky, and from an early age was drawn to the maze of underground passageways that riddled the region. His family had once operated a show cave called Great Crystal Cave, but its remote location meant few visitors and little profit. Like many enterprising cavers of his era, he hoped to find a more accessible cave that could be developed for tourism, one that would bring both fame and fortune to him and those who partnered with him. In the winter of 1925, he began exploring a promising site known as Sand Cave on land owned by his neighbour Beasley Doyle, a location just beside a busy road and within easy reach of other popular attractions near Mammoth Cave. On the morning of January 30th, 1925, Collins entered Sand Cave alone with only a kerosene lantern to light his way. Beneath his feet the earth was cool and still, the walls closing in and opening up in unpredictable rhythm as he crawled through passages so tight that at times he had to inch forward on his stomach, one arm stretched ahead to hold his flickering lantern and the other at his side to feel for walls. The cave offered challenge and promise, but light in those depths was a fragile thing, and when his lamp began to dim, he made the choice every splunker fears, to turn back before the darkness claimed him. That decision proved fatal. As Collins retreated through the narrow corridor back toward the entrance, his foot slipped against loose rock and dislodged a 27-pound stone that fell from above, pinning his ankle against the cave floor. He tried to pull free, but the rock settled like a stone straitjacket, his leg wedged so tightly that every effort he made just buried him deeper in gravel and rubble. At first, it must have seemed like a grotesque misfortune he could still survive. But over the coming hours and days, it became clear that the narrow passageway, the hidden depths of the cave, and the sheer weight of the earth around him had turned a single misstep into a slow, impossible death sentence. When Collins failed to return that night, his neighbours grew anxious. They found his coat hanging outside the cave and realised something was terribly wrong. In the early hours of the next day, a 17-year-old boy named Jewel Estes managed to crawl far enough into Sand Cave to reach Collins and communicate with him, confirming that he was alive, trapped, frightened, and alone. Word spread quickly through Cave City, a little town at the edge of Mammoth Cave's vast subterranean network, and soon men local to the region had begun digging and probing their way toward him, bringing food and water where they could, and vowing to bring him out of the cave alive. But Sand Cave was no simple hole in the ground, and the passage that held Collins was no easy way to reach. What had begun as an optimistic attempt to free him devolved into a chaotic scramble of volunteers, friends, family members, and curious bystanders, all drawn by fear for his life and the strange magnetism of a man buried in the earth. At first, efforts were uncoordinated. Some brought food and drink down to Collins, but were too fearful or ill-equipped to find a way to free him, stashing supplies and hoping someone better prepared would take up the task. His younger brother Homer and other family friends spent days making trips into the passage carrying whatever they could, but every attempt to dig him free by hand ended in frustration. Almost before the rescue effort had properly begun, the story caught the attention of newspapers across the region and then the nation. A young reporter from the Louisville Courier-Journal named William Burke Skeets Miller arrived in Cave City seeking details, but upon seeing Collins for himself, he paused his reporting and began participating in the rescue attempts. Miller would be one of the few journalists to crawl into the cave to speak directly with Collins, recording his last thoughts and relaying his voice back to editors far above the earth. An early and haunting use of broadcast news that drew thousands of readers into the drama. The crowds that gathered outside the mouth of the cave soon numbered in the thousands. Vendors set up tents to sell food and drink and souvenirs of the unfolding tragedy, and the air around Sand Cave took on an almost carnival atmosphere that many who had come for solemn concern found hard to resist. Officials were eventually forced to call in the National Guard to maintain order, to keep sightseers from interfering with the painstaking rescue work being done by engineers, miners, and volunteers who dug with picks and shovels, hoping to break through the rock and earth that imprisoned Collins. Rescuers knew that blasting through the delicate cave structure with drills or dynamite might collapse the passage entirely and bury Collins forever, so they opted for a more laborious but safer method, sinking a vertical shaft straight down from above, the hope being that it could reach a point adjacent to where Collins was trapped and offer a new route of access. However, the earth defied their best efforts, slowing their progress to a crawl, just as the cold winter weather hardened the soil and drove temperatures down. There was no easy way to dig down 60 feet into solid ground with only hand tools, and as days passed, the cruel inevitability of time began to weigh on the minds of everyone there. Rumours and speculation ran rampant in the media, and among those gathered at the site. Some whispered that the entire event was a hoax, designed to lure tourists to Kentucky's cave country, while others accused rescuers of withholding food and water, or suggested Collins had been murdered and buried alive to silence him. A military court of inquiry was convened in Cave City to investigate these claims, but as the truth of his entrapment became clear, such theories faded into rumour. Still, with every passing day, the hope of seeing Collins emerge from the earth waned, and for every voice that spoke out in confidence, there was another that feared the worst. Inside the cave, Collins fought for life as best he could. He had survived the initial accident, but the cold, the hunger, and the exhaustion took their toll. He endured periods of lucidity interspersed with stupor and numbness, and for a time he survived on the small supplies his brother and others managed to bring him. Rescuers strung electric lights into the cave to provide warmth and some semblance of comfort, but the slow progress of the shaft and the constant threat of further cave collapses meant there was no quick path to salvation. Outside, newspapers printed updates daily, turning Collins's plight into a human story that Americans followed with a mixture of horror and fascination, as though watching a tragedy unfold on stage. By February, the cold had deepened, and the rescue shaft was still nowhere near Collins's location. Snow and rain hampered efforts, as the earth around the work site became unstable and dangerous. Reports from the scene described cars backed up for miles along the roads leading to Sand Cave, motion picture crews capturing every moment, and voices of hope and despair alike echoing through the gathered crowds. At times, the cave itself seemed to conspire against them. Cracks widened in its walls, rocks sloughed into passageways, and every attempt to push closer seemed to invite more collapse. Even as engineers and soldiers worked with what skill they had, the ground around them gave way a little more each day, as if the bowels of the earth resented the intrusion. Amid the tension, the logistical challenges of the rescue added to the drama. Engineers had to devise pulley systems to lower men and supplies down the narrow shaft, while local blacksmiths and miners fashioned crude but functional tools on the spot. Medical personnel stationed at the surface anxiously monitored Collins's vital signs, though they could do little more than offer encouragement and prayer. Every slip of a shovel or misjudged strike on rock threatened to undo hours of labour and imperil the fragile lifeline to the trapped man below. The national media played a role unlike any previous US rescue story. Newspapers printed daily updates in bold headlines, and some journalists positioned themselves so close to the shaft that they risked falling in themselves. Radio broadcasts began to mention the story, and amateur photographers captured the scene, making Floyd Collins's entrapment one of the earliest instances where a human tragedy unfolded simultaneously in both print and visual media. Families in distant states read of his plight and followed every development with a mix of horror and fascination, creating a shared suspense that seemed to stretch across the entire country. On February 15th, nearly 17 days after Collins became trapped, the rescuers broke through the final wall of the shaft into a sand cave passage just above where Collins had been pinned. But when miner Ed Brenner made his way down the tunnel and into the chamber, he found only lifeless stillness. Collins had died of exhaustion, exposure and starvation, his body cold and unresponsive, and though the rescue shaft had nearly reached him, it had been too late. Rumours that he had perished days earlier were confirmed, and the grief of those who had laboured so long and hard to save him was as palpable as the cold winter air that filled the cavern beyond. In the bitter aftermath, with Collins's body still trapped by the stone that had mortally wounded him, the decision was made to seal Sand Cave and leave him undisturbed, a grim tomb beneath the earth for a man who had dreamed of exploring its depths. Only months later, at the urging of his family, workers returned, dug a new tunnel around the obstruction, and retrieved his remains for a proper burial at the Mammoth Cave Baptist Church Cemetery not far from where his life had begun. The tragedy, however, was not buried with him. It became etched into the national memory, inspiring books, a musical, and even a Hollywood film, and it drew attention to the fragile awe of cave exploring and the unpredictable dangers that lie hidden beneath the surface of the earth. In the end, the story of Floyd Collins became more than the story of a man trapped underground. It became a cautionary tale about the seductive lure of the unknown and the merciless indifference of the silent caverns he loved so dearly. And long after the crowds had dissipated and the lights were darkened at the mouth of Sand Cave, the echo of those days of suspense lingered like a whisper in the stone, a reminder that some depths are too unforgiving to ever be fully conquered. In the cold, echoing darkness beneath Kentucky, a man's last struggle became a nation's haunting memory. The flood that turned Mossdale Caverns into a tomb. A grey curtain of clouds pressed over the Yorkshire Dales, and beneath it the narrow mouth of Mossdale Caverns yawned like a silent warning to those daring enough to enter. The limestone cliffs, slick with winter rain, seemed to lean in over the entrance, funneling the chill wind down into the subterranean network below. Locals had long known Mossdale as a dangerous labyrinth, its passages twisting in unpredictable directions, sometimes wide enough for a man to stand, sometimes narrow enough to force crawling on elbows and knees. On June 24th, 1967, 6 experienced cavers approached the entrance with a mixture of anticipation and caution, unaware that a violent storm was building high above them. Each step into the cavern carried them farther from sunlight and civilization, and the darkness closed in with a weight that pressed on both mind and body, as though the earth itself were conspiring to swallow them whole. Within the first 50 feet, water trickled along jagged limestone walls, pooling in shadowed hollows that seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, as if the cave itself were drawing breath. Mossdale Caverns was known for its underground river Mossdale Beck, which vanished into the cave floor and re-emerged kilometres away through passages no one had ever fully mapped. The air inside the cave was cool and damp, smelling faintly of mineral deposits and wet stone, and each echo of dripping water sounded amplified like the slow ticking of some vast subterranean clock. Even before the storm hit, the cavers noted subtle changes in the flow of water through the chambers, small warnings that would later prove critical. Tiny eddies of silt swirled in pools, carrying small leaves and twigs from the surface, as though the cave were signalling its connection to the tempest brewing above. 6 men checked their ropes, helmets and lamps, voices calm but taut with focus, each aware that the cave had claimed lives before yet confident in their collective skill. Among them were seasoned cavers who had navigated the most difficult passages of the Dales, familiar with the tight squeezes, the flooded sections, and the mental strain of hours spent underground. They spoke in clipped sentences, sharing maps and observations, and measured each step with care. Their goal was to reach Stream End, a far-flung chamber thought to hold new passages that might connect to the elusive outflow of Mossdale Beck. Every member of the group knew the stakes, yet the thrill of discovery and the challenge of the cave's labyrinthine channels carried them forward, their determination almost imperceptibly spurring the cave to reveal its hidden complexities. Rain began hammering the uplands, a relentless rhythm that sent torrents coursing into the underground rivers, swelling the channels faster than the cavers had anticipated. Above ground, the sky darkened with heavy clouds, wind-driving sheets of water across the dales. Streams that normally fed the cavern at a steady pace now surged, carrying silt and debris into the passages with alarming force. By mid-afternoon, what had been manageable water began to rise along the floors of the tunnels, snaking through every crevice, threading into chambers that had once been dry. Even the most experienced among the cavers recognized the danger in the rhythm of that rising water, but the remote sections they were exploring left little room for a hasty retreat. Each new chamber they entered became a potential trap, the walls echoing with the sound of rushing water that seemed to anticipate their movements. Cold water surged along their knees and then their waists as the group scrambled through narrow chambers, every step a calculation against the pressure of rising currents and slippery rock. Passageways they had measured as tolerable hours earlier now threatened to sweep them off balance, and the echoing roar of water in distant chambers grew louder, an almost sentient reminder of nature's indifferent power. Some were forced to swim through waist-deep sections, lamps held high, hearts pounding as the water battered them from unseen angles. Each turn of the passage offered the possibility of safety or entrapment, and with the storm above, even a familiar chamber could transform into a trap. The echoes of frantic breaths mingled with the water's roar, creating a symphony of fear that seemed to pulse through the limestone itself. They wedged themselves into alcoves, stacked stones as makeshift barriers, and clutched rope lines, straining to keep dry air above their heads while listening to the roar that grew louder behind each twist of the passage. In the narrow confines of Far Marathon, a 900-foot-long crawl only 10 inches high in some places, the water filled the bottom of the tunnel, forcing the men to pull themselves along by hands and forearms, while the river beneath threatened to drag them into deeper channels. Time slowed in that dark, wet crawl. Minutes stretched into hours, each breath a mixture of cold, fear and determination. Their bodies were exhausted, muscles burning, yet they pressed forward, aware that hesitation could be fatal. Even familiar handholds offered no reassurance, slick with mud and flowing water, as though the cave itself were testing their skill and resolve. The river beneath the cave swelled beyond reason, its velocity shredding fragile formations and forcing the cavers into a frantic retreat that left little room for coordination or hope. Rocks that had been stable in previous visits loosened under the force of the flood, and sudden currents tore away handholds and footholds alike. Screams echoed through the chambers as men struggled to maintain balance, one accidentally losing a rope to the rushing water. It was in these moments that the cave revealed itself not as a passive labyrinth but as a merciless adversary, a living, unyielding environment where even the most meticulous preparation could be undone in an instant. Pools of icy water rose unnervingly fast, swallowing carefully chosen footholds and carrying with them scraps of equipment that vanished into unseen chasms. When the storm finally relented, the caverns lay eerily silent, the water slowly draining to reveal a chamber frozen in time. The 6 victims' final positions, a chilling map of desperation and misfortune. Their bodies were discovered in various postures of last resistance, some wedged against rock walls, others partially submerged in shallow pools, each surrounded by debris carried in by the flood. The very passages that had promised adventure had become tombs, the narrow twists and turns cruelly dictating the final struggle of each man. Rescuers noted the violence of the water and the precision of its destruction, tracing how the flood waters had surged and receded, leaving a grim testament to both power and unpredictability. Stalactites and delicate formations were snapped or scoured clean by the current, silent witnesses to the force that had swept the cavers from life. In the aftermath, Mossdale Caverns became synonymous with the dangers of underground exploration, a reminder that skill and experience were no guarantee against the whims of nature. The deaths of those 6 men were recorded meticulously by the British Speleological Association, and their tragedy prompted new discussions on cave safety, storm awareness, and the need for accurate flood monitoring in such delicate subterranean systems. Maps of the caverns were updated with cautionary notes, but the knowledge of every narrow squeeze and treacherous chamber could never erase the human cost. The disaster also inspired more detailed studies of cave hydrology, highlighting the terrifying speed with which surface storms could turn a familiar network of passages into a death trap. And somewhere deep beneath the dales, where sunlight never penetrates and water flows with cold, merciless patience, the echoes of that storm still whisper the secrets of those who never returned. The diver who survived 3 weeks in the dark, Peter Verhulzel. Water pooled silently in the submerged corridors of the Sterkfontein caves, reflecting the dim glow of Peter Verhulzel's helmet light, like a shard of fractured sky trapped underground. The network of tunnels stretched in all directions, narrow passages twisting back on themselves, sometimes dropping into unseen vertical shafts, sometimes opening into chambers of strange, echoing calm. It was a cave system that had claimed explorers before, a labyrinth few had seen, and Verhulzel moved cautiously, tethered to a guideline that would later betray him, leading him into the hidden heart of the submerged corridors. At first, his dive was routine, a series of measured kicks through underwater passages familiar to him from prior explorations. He checked his oxygen, verified his depth, and marked each turn with the practiced precision of a diver who had navigated countless submerged mazes. But somewhere in the twisting channels, a current shifted, pulling him off course. One moment, he was following the familiar rope, and the next it had disappeared behind a bend, leaving him in absolute darkness. Every instinct screamed to retrace his path, but in the eerie silence, with water pressing against every side, the certainty of orientation dissolved. The cave, previously a controlled environment, became an endless, unknowable void. The first realization was immediate and terrifying. Verhulzel was alone. Without the guideline, he could not find the exit, and the familiar patterns of the tunnels became alien. He tried to remain calm, exploring nearby pockets and chambers for a place to wait, hoping to encounter the main passage again. Hours passed with the same unbroken quiet, punctuated only by the muted sound of his own breathing through the regulator. Each bubble that rose toward the surface seemed impossibly loud, an accusation of solitude in a world where no one could hear his plight. He swam cautiously into side passages, the ceiling close enough to brush with his helmet, the water opaque with silt stirred from the floor, turning visibility to a near black. Eventually he discovered a small air pocket, a hidden void above the submerged tunnels that offered just enough room to breathe and survive. He clung to it, pressing against the damp walls, rationing his oxygen, and marking the small territory with his flashlight. Days stretched interminably, each hour indistinguishable from the next, as he moved minimally to conserve energy. Hunger gnawed steadily, and the cold water seeped through every layer, chilling him to the bone. His body ached, but his mind refused to give in, clinging to fragments of training and survival instinct. Somewhere nearby, other divers and rescuers searched in vain, unaware that he existed in that narrow, hidden pocket. Verhulzel's mind wandered, sometimes recalling earlier tragedies he had studied. Stories of men trapped in sand cave or mossdale caverns, lives claimed not by recklessness, but by the indifferent precision of nature. The cave around him seemed almost sentient, a cold and watchful entity, its water-filled chambers alive with currents and eddies that shifted unpredictably. At times he floated silently, letting the dark press against his back, listening to the subtle movements of water as though it whispered secrets he could almost understand. Days blurred into a week, then more. Rescue teams penetrated accessible sections, exploring every known passage, following oxygen lines and markers, but always a step behind the concealed air pocket. Verhulzel's small, improvised refuges kept him alive, yet the lack of sustenance and the slow burn of fatigue weighed relentlessly. He subsisted on minimal air pockets, trying to keep warm against the cold of submerged stone, each breath a delicate calculation. He whispered names, rehearsed plans, and even spoke to imagined rescuers, a measure against the isolation that could easily consume the mind. The cave itself enforced a quiet that no human voice could alter, shaping the hours into an oppressive rhythm of patience and desperation. The final days were a delicate battle between survival and surrender. Verhulsel remained conscious enough to understand the limits of his situation, but starvation began to dominate his thoughts, and the once vivid tunnel system became a maze of shadows and shapes. Every small air pocket seemed too distant, every submerged path a risk, and every movement carried a danger of dislodging silt or becoming trapped in narrower passages. Above him, rescuers explored nearby tunnels and passages, unaware that only a few meters of solid rock separated them from the man they sought. Their search, meticulous and urgent, could not reach the hidden air pocket, and every turn they took brought them unknowingly closer and yet infinitely far. Eventually Verhulsel succumbed to the deprivation, his last thoughts perhaps a mix of quiet resignation, lingering curiosity about the cave's hidden channels, and a deep, human longing for light. The air pocket that had been a sanctuary became a tomb, the cave's dark corridors claiming another life in its long record of those who had tested its limits. When rescuers finally traced the diver's path and located his body, it was a revelation of the silent, patient cruelty that caves could exert, a stark reminder that even the most experienced explorers could vanish, sometimes within sight of those searching for them. In the end, the Sterkfontein incident left a lingering tension in the caving community, a sober understanding of the labyrinthine dangers that lurked beneath even well-known passages. It underscored the peril of dependence on lines and markers, the unpredictability of subterranean water, and the invisible boundaries between life and death within the stone and darkness. It also became a story whispered alongside other unsolved or tragic disappearances in isolated, unforgiving landscapes, reminding all who ventured below that sometimes survival depended not only on skill, but on forces beyond comprehension. Deep within Sterkfontein's flooded passages, the current whispers along, holding the faint echo of a diver who vanished beneath the shadows. The shaft that became Neil Moss's grave. The narrow vertical shaft of Devil's Chimney plunged into darkness, a silent invitation to those who sought adventure, and a warning to those who had heard of explorers who vanished. Peak Cavern, one of Derbyshire's most storied caves, had long drawn thrill-seekers and young spelunkers eager to challenge its twisting passages and towering chambers. Yet few anticipated the quiet, patient cruelty of its tightest vertical shaft, a place where stone could become both guide and executioner. On a crisp day in April 1959, 17-year-old Neil Moss approached the mouth of Devil's Chimney with a mixture of excitement and careful attention, unaware that the chimney's reputation for unforgiving constrictions would soon claim his life and transform a simple exploration into one of Britain's most haunting caving tragedies. Neil Moss, slight in build but seasoned enough to navigate Derbyshire's complex limestone networks, wore a helmet, harness, and carried ropes and a lamp, each piece of equipment chosen for both function and the illusion of safety. His companions, equally practiced in the art of subterranean navigation, observed the young man with the mixture of trust and caution common among small, tight-knit caving parties. As Moss began his descent, the walls of Devil's Chimney rose like a cathedral of stone, narrowing unpredictably with jutting ledges and slick surfaces that required precision and patience. Each foothold demanded attention, each handhold seemed calculated to test his nerve, and the dim glow of his lamp revealed surfaces that gleamed wetly with condensation and the silent weight of centuries. In that narrow chamber, the limestone itself seemed to breathe, the whisper of dripping water carrying a sense of anticipation and latent menace. At first, the descent proceeded smoothly, the rhythmic scrape of helmet and rope marking progress against the stone. Moss noted familiar landmarks, the subtle widening of the chimney here, the near imperceptible twist there, and breathed in the mineral scent of limestone dampened by centuries of seepage. Small pockets of air trapped in recesses above and below created subtle pressure differences so that every inhalation carried an almost tangible resistance. But as he moved deeper, the shaft constricted abruptly, forcing him into an inverted position to squeeze through a narrow crevice. It was here that the miscalculation occurred. The angle, the pressure, and the stone alignment combined to trap him upside down. His body wedged so tightly that attempts to shift even an inch sent pain radiating through limbs and spine. The very stone he had relied upon became an unyielding captor, a silent sentinel that refused negotiation. Above him, His companions called out, voices echoing faintly through the vertical shaft, unaware of how critical the situation had become. Early efforts to free him were tentative, hands probing, ropes tugging, and careful leverage applied to loosen the stone pinning him. Hours passed with minimal progress. Every attempt seemed to tighten the trap. The more the rescuers pulled, the more the narrow walls resisted. Moss could only offer instructions, encouragement, or warnings as best he could, but the inversion made movement agonizing and breath increasingly difficult. The physical strain compounded by the psychological pressure of being suspended between hope and the unforgiving rock made each minute indefinite. The echo of his own breath and strained commands became a rhythm in the cave, a ghostly cadence marking time that might never end. Rescue methods grew more elaborate as time passed. Volunteers tried harnesses, mechanical jacks, and angled levers, all designed to dislodge the stone or reposition Moss. Yet the shaft's geometry and the weight of the surrounding rock rendered their best efforts insufficient. Darkness pooled below him, reflecting only the faint glimmer of a lamp above, while the narrow walls pressed relentlessly against shoulders and thighs. Above ground, spring air had turned damp and cold, chilling the rescuers as they bent over ropes and tools, their own bodies straining against fatigue. Every failed attempt tightened the atmosphere. Each sound of shifting stone echoed like a warning from the cavern itself. The technical knowledge of the party collided with the stubborn obstinacy of natural formations, a lesson in the limits of human ingenuity against geological inevitability. Even the faintest vibration in the limestone threatened to worsen the entrapment, and the possibility that Moss's position might become permanently fixed loomed over every effort. The hours stretched into a tense, suspended day as the rescuers debated the use of cutting tools or more extreme measures. Surveyed from above, the chimney appeared deceptively static, yet within, the interaction of moisture, gravity, and pressure made every decision fraught with risk. Moss's harness and rope lines, meticulously arranged, offered scant advantage in the fight against the cave's unyielding geometry, and every careful pull risked injury to both rescuer and victim. The sensation of inversion pressed on his chest and lungs, his head angled downward into a narrow pocket where droplets fell incessantly, collecting in small puddles that cooled his skin and tested his concentration. The cave's quiet presence was oppressive, the stone silent yet vividly alive to the struggle within. As night fell and fatigue deepened, hope became a measured commodity. The psychological pressure grew heavier than the weight of stone on Moss's body. Communication was limited, tethered to shouts and hand signals, as exhaustion and discomfort sapped energy. Every inhalation required effort against gravity and compression. Every muscle ached with tension, and the notion of a safe, simple rescue became increasingly remote. The inversion itself became dangerous. Prolonged pressure on the circulatory system, the strain on the lungs, and the numbing effect of restricted movement added urgency to a problem that seemed physically insoluble. It was in these hours that the cave revealed itself not merely as a challenge to human skill, but as a patient arbiter of fate, indifferent to courage, preparation, or will. Authorities and experienced cavers recognized the impossibility of extraction without severe risk of further collapse or injury. Each plan was weighed against potential catastrophe. A miscalculated shove or sudden jolt could wedge Moss tighter, dislodge stone onto rescuers, or destabilize the shaft entirely. The cavern's verticality limited access to only a few angles, while the narrow width denied safe maneuvering. Hours of careful calculation yielded little progress, and the young explorer remained trapped, suspended in a silent stalemate with the limestone that had once seemed welcoming. Every subtle movement of rope, every creak of equipment, resonated through the stone, reminding all that the cavern dictated the pace and limits of rescue. The decision to seal the shaft was reluctantly made, a compromise between survival and catastrophe. The weight of inevitability pressed down on all present. Moss's companions and rescue teams watched in grim understanding, the gravity of the choice etched on every strained face. Practicality overrode emotion, yet the moral cost was evident. To close the passage was to accept the cave's supremacy, to leave the life it held behind, and to acknowledge the limits of human endurance. Above ground, the cool night air did little to dissipate the sorrow and shock, while below the stone patiently awaited, unchanging and implacable. The act was both practical and profoundly haunting, a confrontation with mortality mediated only by rock. The aftermath was a mixture of grief, analysis, and silent reflection. Peak Cavern, previously a site of exploration and adventure, now bore the memory of a young life claimed by the chimney's narrow confines. Lessons were learned: careful measurement of passages, enhanced safety protocols, and increased understanding of how small miscalculations could have fatal consequences. Yet even with the best preparation, the cave's inherent risks remained immutable. Maps and guides noted hazards, but the true nature of the vertical shaft, the unyielding stone, the sudden constrictions, the peril of inversion, could not be mitigated by any human hand. In retrospect, the geological subtleties of the chimney, the weight distribution, moisture-lubricated surfaces, and unpredictable shifts of centuries-old limestone revealed themselves as silent arbiters of the tragedy. For years afterward, caving communities recounted the tragedy of Neil Moss with hushed tones, a cautionary tale underscoring the quiet, persistent danger of underground exploration. Unlike floods, collapses, or accidents with witnesses, the Devil's Chimney incident emphasized isolation, confinement, and the patience of geological time, where a single misstep could turn routine adventure into fatal imprisonment. Visitors to Peak Cavern often pause near the site, sensing the cavern's somber history and the lingering presence of its quiet authority. The lessons, whispered in maps, reports, and oral history, became inseparable from the stone itself. Even seasoned cavers, when recalling Moss's story, spoke of the shaft with a reverence reserved for places where nature exercises both patience and silent judgment. Long after the ropes were coiled and rescuers departed, the narrow vertical shaft remained unchanged, a silent memorial to a life claimed by both stone and circumstance. The memory of Neil Moss and his struggle persisted in the minds of those who had witnessed, measured, or heard the story, an indelible reminder of the cave's latent power. Beneath the surface of Derbyshire, Devil's Chimney waits quietly, patient and unyielding, a vertical testament to the stubborn permanence of stone and the fragility of life. Trapped in the crystal labyrinth, the death of Emily Davis in Lechuguilla cave. The story of Emily Davis began in a far quieter, hidden corner of the world, in the unlit corridors of Lechuguilla Cave, New Mexico. Known for its extraordinary formations and extreme remoteness, Lechuguilla had earned a reputation among spelunkers as both mesmerizing and unforgiving. On September 14, 1991, Davis, an experienced caver drawn to the cave's labyrinthine passages and delicate crystal formations, entered the cave carrying only the tools, lights, and supplies deemed essential for navigating its fragile underworld. What awaited her was not just the physical challenge of the descent, but the subtle, patient danger of a cave environment where every surface could betray even the most careful explorer, and where air pockets, unseen fissures, and shifts in temperature could have lethal consequences. Lechuguilla Cave extends over 200 kilometers of mapped passageways, yet much of its network remained unmapped in 1991, known only to a small group of dedicated cavers. The air is thin in many of its deep reaches, carrying the faint mineral tang of gypsum and sulfur, while the narrow corridors are often slick with moisture and lined with formations that crumble under the slightest touch. As Davis moved further from the known entrance, the cave seemed to constrict around her. Each chamber was a quiet theatre of shadows, stalactites dripping in intermittent rhythm, while the crystalline floor glimmered faintly under the beam of her headlamp. The cave's fragile gypsum chandeliers and gypsum crusts added both beauty and hidden hazard. Even a slight disturbance could fracture surfaces, releasing shards or dust into the air and masking structural weaknesses. Davis had trained for extreme subterranean environments, yet Lechuguilla posed a different challenge, one of subtle peril. The passages she explored that day were not wide enough to allow standing. In many stretches, cavers had to wriggle, pressing against walls slick with condensation, testing their physical endurance and spatial judgment simultaneously. She moved slowly, deliberately, mapping as she went, aware that the cave's fragile ecosystem could not withstand careless handling. Even so, she noted small signs that hinted at instability. A thin fissure along the ceiling, a scattering of recently dislodged rock, a faint hiss of shifting air through unseen chambers, and subtle changes in temperature that signaled hidden voids beyond sight. These clues, imperceptible to all but the most trained eyes, were warnings of the cave's potential cruelty. At some point in the crystal labyrinth section of the cave, Davis entered a chamber whose ceiling sloped downward into a jagged constriction. A misjudged step caused a small rock slab to shift, momentarily wedging her against the crystalline walls. What might have been a minor obstruction in a more forgiving cave became perilous in Lechuguilla. The slab trapped her shoulder, and in the process of trying to free herself, Davis dislodged another fragment, which tumbled down to wedge against her torso. Hours passed as she attempted to maneuver free, but the cave's narrow confines allowed no room for leverage, and every movement risked dislodging more debris. The cave's inherent isolation magnified the danger, with passages so remote even experienced companions could not reach her quickly, and the surrounding rock formations offered no hint of mercy. Outside, Davis's companions waited at a distant staging area, unaware that she had become trapped. Lechuguilla's passages are famously convoluted. Even experienced cavers could become disoriented without meticulous guideline placement. The narrow conduits that led to the crystal labyrinth section were so complex that a rescuer following her trail might never reach her before the critical time passed. Her absence was initially attributed to delayed exploration, but as hours stretched, concern mounted. Contact through radios or shouting was impossible. The cave swallowed sound, and the convoluted channels reflected only silence. Rescuers would later note that even a subtle misstep could mean hours lost in disorienting loops of corridors that seem identical under lamplight. Inside the chamber, Davis endured exhaustion, constriction, and cold. Her lamp flickered intermittently, casting long, shifting shadows against the mineral walls, and the faint, rhythmic drip of water sounded both life-affirming and ominous. She attempted to ration her oxygen, conserve energy, and focus on possible escape routes, but the structural complexity of the chamber left few options. With every minute, the fragility of the surrounding crystal formations weighed upon her, the cave's slow, inexorable force pressing as surely as gravity itself. The combination of thin air pockets and near-stagnant ventilation made breathing laborious, and the subtle movement of dust and gypsum fragments suggested shifts in the cavern's delicate equilibrium, a warning that the chamber could alter in ways invisible to the trapped explorer. Rescue efforts, once organised, faced immediate challenges. The Crystal Labyrinth is a section of Lechuguilla noted for its delicate formations and unstable ceilings. Any attempt to enter without proper assessment could have compounded the risk, endangering both the trapped caver and potential rescuers. Teams carefully plotted approaches, but progress was slow. Each narrow crawl required securing fragile floor and ceiling formations, and the risk of dislodging critical supports forced painstaking caution. Even as knowledge of Davis's likely position grew, the passage's complexity made timing critical. Every delay allowed her energy to wane further. Air quality monitoring and careful route planning became essential, because a single miscalculation could have suffocated rescuers or trapped them alongside her. As hours turned to a day, the passage's isolation became a critical factor. Davis's situation was complicated by the cave's high humidity, which drained her strength, and by the faint but constant risk of shifting crystal and rock. In such confined spaces, minor fatigue can become catastrophic. A slip could wedge her tighter, and any misjudged movement might accelerate injury. She moved as carefully as possible, yet the confined space left her virtually immobile. The cave's stillness contrasted starkly with the growing urgency outside, where teams worked to plan a safe extraction without damaging the intricate formations or causing secondary collapses. Even the faintest vibration from above ground could have propagated through the delicate stone, illustrating the cave's unyielding sensitivity. Despite the efforts of her companions, Davis eventually succumbed to starvation, exhaustion, and dehydration. The remote location and the difficulty of access meant that she was isolated from any aid that might have arrived in a more forgiving environment. Her body was later recovered after meticulous planning, with rescuers forced to navigate the same fragile passages that had trapped her. The retrieval required extreme caution to prevent damage to the cave's structures, preserving Lechuguilla's delicate ecosystem while respecting the human life lost. The intricacy of the recovery reinforced how uniquely dangerous this subterranean labyrinth was. Every centimetre could conceal unseen instability. Lechuguilla Cave, already legendary for its otherworldly beauty and immense underground passages, gained a new reputation in the aftermath, a place where precision, patience, and respect for natural fragility are not merely advisable but essential for survival. The death of Emily Davis underscored a fundamental truth of extreme cave exploration. Mastery of skill does not guarantee mastery of the environment. The cave does not negotiate, it does not yield to intent or experience. In its hidden chambers, beauty and danger coexist with a quiet, inexorable inevitability. Even subtle shifts in air, temperature, or water accumulation could imperil life, showing that the subterranean world has its own timetable, indifferent to human ambition. Even today, those who traverse Lechuguilla's passages recount the story of Davis as a cautionary tale, emphasizing the importance of meticulous planning, respect for fragile formations, and awareness of the cave's unpredictable temperament. Her story reminds explorers that every unmapped passage carries the potential for isolation, and that the invisible hazards of narrow, unstable chambers can turn an act of discovery into a fight for life. Maps can record dimensions, guides can note hazards, but the silent threat of a shifting stone, a hidden fissure, or a trapped corridor can never be fully mitigated. Air pockets, unseen channels, and fragile mineral crusts ensure that each expedition remains a negotiation with forces far older than any human participant. In the crystal labyrinth, the delicate stalactites and gypsum crusts gleam in silence, keeping their secrets well, while the faint traces of human presence vanish quickly under the cave's patient processes. The corridors that claimed Emily Davis are no longer touched without reverence, a silent testament to the peril of navigating hidden worlds where every misstep can carry consequences beyond comprehension. Each chamber, each delicate formation, is a reminder that even the most experienced explorers are merely temporary visitors in a realm that observes, waits, and decides in silence. The labyrinth holds its breath, as it has for centuries, keeping its dead and its mysteries close, a reminder that even the most careful exploration cannot tame the hidden heart of the earth. The crystal labyrinth remains untouched and unyielding, a silent guardian of its own secrets and those who never emerged. 3 days behind the gate. The Sullivan Cave Lock-in. The cavern swallowed the fading light, leaving only a narrow corridor lined with damp limestone and the faint echo of dripping water. Sullivan Cave, a sprawling system beneath southern Indiana, was familiar to university caving clubs. Yet even seasoned explorers never quite shook the sense that the walls could shift subtly, guiding or confounding their steps. On this day, one young caver lingered behind the main group, taking measurements and sketching passages with meticulous care, unaware that the routine closure of the cave's entrance gate would soon leave him trapped in an underground solitude both quiet and oppressive. The air carried a faint mineral tang, a mixture of iron and limestone dust, and the subtle temperature variations hinted at hidden chambers yet to be discovered. The air was thick with the metallic scent of wet stone, and every step sent tremors that whispered through the twisting passageways. Sullivan's passages narrowed and widened unpredictably, with ceiling drops that forced crouches and occasional low crawls across smooth limestone slick with moisture. The young explorer's headlamp cast elongated shadows, revealing stalactites and flowstone formations that gleamed like pale teeth in the dark. Each step required deliberate attention. A misjudged movement could unbalance him or scrape delicate surfaces, and in the solitude of the cave each sound amplified into a resonance that seemed alive. Small fissures released faint gusts of air that whispered along the walls, suggesting spaces beyond his immediate view, yet offering no promise of escape. It was only when he turned back toward the entrance that the reality hit. The gate had closed, leaving him behind in a silence so profound it seemed to press against his chest. No voices, no footsteps. Nothing indicated the passage of those he had just left. For a moment, he wondered if the sound of the lock's metal latch might echo faintly above him, yet no such reassurance came. The small corridor that had seemed mundane during the group's exploration now felt alien, as though the cave itself had conspired to conceal him, separating him from the familiar world with stone and shadow. He tested the air, noting subtle changes in humidity and the occasional echo that hinted at side passages he could not yet see, each one offering both curiosity and potential peril. He crawled forward cautiously, memorizing the subtle shifts in the ceiling, the occasional glint of mineral deposits, and the gentle slope of the floor beneath his hands. Chalk marks he had left earlier became guides for orientation, yet even these were insufficient against the maze of interconnected passageways. He paused to breathe, listening to the distant drip of water and the faint sigh of air flowing through fissures. Each inhalation carried the chill of the underground, a reminder that temperature and moisture were as much obstacles as distance or darkness. Small puddles reflected the beam of his headlamp, rippling whenever he moved, creating the illusion of shifting walls that made the corridor feel alive. Hours merged into a continuous rhythm of measured movement, punctuated by the steady drip of water and the cold draft that seeped through hidden fissures. He explored small side passages cautiously, testing each narrow corridor before committing, aware that even a slight misstep could wedge him against stone or disturb fragile formations. Occasionally he crouched in wider chambers, resting while listening to the cave's subtle noises, stones settling, water pooling, air shifting, and marking the passage of time by the dripping cadence. Sometimes he paused to watch delicate mineral crystals glint like tiny stars, marvelling at their fragile persistence even in the oppressive darkness. With careful deliberation, he rationed water and adjusted clothing to conserve heat, marking small territories along the passage with chalk to maintain orientation. Hunger gnawed steadily, but the young caver balanced his intake against the slow pace of survival, eating only when necessary. He adjusted headlamp batteries to conserve light and kept movements minimal to avoid unnecessary fatigue. Every corridor traversed, every junction negotiated, reinforced the sense that the cave demanded patience as much as skill, and that errors could be immediate and unforgiving. He noted subtle changes in airflow, imagining that the cave might shift ever so slightly around him, guiding him deeper into its maze-like interior. Above ground, preparations continued without interruption, as his companions mapped routes and checked supplies, unaware that one of their own had already disappeared into the cave's labyrinth. Outside, the sun rose and fell with a rhythm that had no relevance below, and the locked entrance gate remained secure, a silent guardian of the underground's unyielding order. Calls to the missing caver went unanswered, and only when careful headcounts were taken did confusion arise, setting rescue plans in motion. But by then, nearly a day had already passed. The contrast between the busy activity above and the still, measured silence below sharpened the sense of separation and vulnerability. Night after night, he tracked the slow passage of time, each moment bringing hunger, exhaustion, and a mounting sense of how unforgiving the underground silence could be. Sleep came sparingly, in short stretches seated against cool limestone, while dreams merged with the cave's shadows into a landscape both familiar and unknowable. He spoke quietly to himself, reciting route descriptions, naming junctions, and imagining guidance from friends above, a strategy to maintain orientation and stave off the creeping disorientation that darkness alone can breed. Every sound, a distant drip, a minor echo, the brushing of water along a wall, became a marker of time and space, a fragile tether to reality. At last, the distant sounds of footsteps and voices reached him, muffled and uncertain, a reminder that even in the most secure-seeming places, life could find its way back. The cave's tight corridors funneled the noises into an eerie resonance, and he responded with cautious calls, signaling that he remained alive yet physically confined. The arrival of companions and rescue personnel brought a rush of relief tempered by the awareness that his ordeal had lasted nearly 3 days, a period in which the underground world had tested endurance, perception, and the patience of a single human alone. As he emerged, the narrow corridors seemed less hostile but retained a quiet, imposing presence, a reminder of the cave's persistent patience and the fragile line between exploration and confinement. The locked gate remained a quiet sentinel, marking the threshold between freedom and the subterranean world that had held him captive, a stark reminder that beneath familiar earth, silence and stone could claim hours, attention and perspective in equal measure. The tight passage that became a tomb, John Jones and Nutty Putty Cave. The narrow mouth of Nutty Putty Cave yawned before him, a black void that promised challenge and concealed peril alike. Located in central Utah, This subterranean labyrinth was famous among cavers for its twisting passages, tight squeezes, and the precarious thrill of navigating spaces few had explored. On that November day in 2009, John Edward Jones, an experienced caver with a calm demeanour and a meticulous approach to safety, entered the cave with a small group, unaware that a single constriction would soon transform routine exploration into an enduring tragedy. Nutty Putty had long held a reputation for testing patience, endurance, and spatial awareness, its twisting corridors demanding both respect and caution from anyone who dared descend. His helmet light danced across slick limestone, casting warped shadows on walls that seemed to lean closer with every step. The cave's corridors, irregular in width and height, funneled Jones into sequences of climbing, crawling, and wriggling that alternated unpredictably. Flowstone and stalactite formations jutted from ceilings and walls, glinting faintly in the dim illumination. Each movement required precision. An errant hand could dislodge rock, scrape delicate formations, or push him into a tighter confinement. Even with experience, Nutty Putty demanded attention, and its subtle changes in contour and gradient were deceptive, luring explorers into a rhythm that could mask danger until it was too late. A constriction loomed ahead, deceptively simple, yet as he navigated the turn, the rock pressed firmly against his shoulders and chest. Known as the birth canal among those familiar with the cave, this tight, inverted passage was unforgiving, barely wide enough to accommodate a fully grown adult, its slope and curvature requiring cavers to descend head first. Jones moved deliberately, testing the walls with gloved hands, sliding slowly into the shaft, unaware that his precise position was already becoming a trap. The limestone pressed in ways impossible to measure from above, and the very act of descent locked him into an alignment that would later defy extraction attempts. Panic flickered, restrained only by training and experience, as the weight of the cave seemed to settle around him like a tangible force. The head-down position restricted circulation, limbs ached with tension, and breathing required deliberate effort. Jones remained calm, issuing instructions to the small team above him, but the physical reality of being wedged in a narrow vertical tunnel quickly exceeded the capacity of any precaution. The cave, silent and unyielding, revealed a patience that no human skill could match, responding to every push or shift with an equally unmovable resistance. Time slowed as every effort to reposition against the stone was met with the subtle, relentless pressure of immovable rock. Voices echoed faintly from the surface as companions realized something had gone wrong, and the first tentative calls reverberated through the labyrinth. Initial attempts to coax Jones free were cautious, hands probing, ropes tugging, and the placement of mechanical pulleys to gain leverage, but the passage's narrow width and irregular surfaces limited every maneuver. Each moment the cave pressed silently against the trapped man, compressing him closer into its stony embrace. Darkness pooled above and below, and the faint light from Jones's helmet reflected off slick walls, a small, flickering witness to the unfolding emergency. Every inch of rope threaded through the narrow shaft was a delicate negotiation with gravity, friction, and the stubborn angles of the surrounding stone. Rescuers tried multiple configurations, stretchers, harnesses, and careful wedges to alter his position, but each adjustment risked pushing him deeper into the confining limestone. The passage offered no forgiveness. A slight jolt could exacerbate the wedging, create injuries, or collapse the precarious formation surrounding him. Coordination became a precise, almost surgical effort, with every volunteer acutely aware that a miscalculation could end the operation before it truly began. The cave's stillness magnified every sound, the scrape of rope against rock, the faint creak of a harness, the muffled strain of human voices echoing against unyielding walls. Time warped underground, each hour stretching into an eternity of cramped stillness, aching limbs, and the slow, persistent drain of energy. Jones's body became increasingly immobilized, circulation faltered, muscles tensed involuntarily, and the compression around his torso and head created an unbearable pressure. Above, rescuers coordinated, planning the next series of attempts with painstaking care, yet each strategy collided with the limitations imposed by the passage itself. The experience was a convergence of human determination and geological indifference. Skill, equipment, and coordination could prolong life but could not guarantee escape. Even the best-trained cavers above could do little beyond precise incremental adjustments. On the surface, friends and family waited with mounting tension, relying on snippets of communication to gauge progress. Supplies were organised, external equipment prepared, and contingency plans discussed, but the constraints of Nutty Putty thwarted most conventional strategies. The narrow shaft demanded patience as much as strength. Haste would have amplified danger for both the trapped man and those attempting to reach him. Every effort, every mechanical adjustment, every rope threaded or repositioned was measured against the immediate threat posed by the cave's unyielding geometry. Above and below, the cave enforced its own tempo, one that human urgency could never fully command. As hours bled into a second day, fatigue compounded both the physical and psychological pressure. Jones, constrained in his inverted posture, faced progressive hypothermia, the gradual numbness of extremities, and the agony of static muscle strain. The cave's silence was relentless. The dripping of water, the occasional subtle shifts of limestone, and the faint vibrations transmitted through the rock became markers of time, rhythm, and isolation. Rescuers rotated in shifts, each team acutely aware that every misjudged movement could worsen his predicament. Yet no passage allowed direct access to the wedge that held him immobile. The psychological weight was as profound as the physical, each participant recognizing the stakes with chilling clarity. Despite elaborate engineering including hydraulic jacks and specially designed pulley systems, the extraction proved impossible. The cave's angles, combined with Jones's wedge position, created a scenario in which every external force risked fatal consequences. Volunteers attempted unconventional methods, from carefully disassembling harnesses to repositioning through auxiliary shafts, yet each adjustment failed to yield a secure path for his removal. The realization emerged gradually. The passage itself had become a tomb, a narrow limestone artery that would not release him, despite all human ingenuity. The interplay of physics, anatomy, and stone rendered even the most courageous efforts insufficient. By the third day, exhaustion dominated every participant. Jones remained conscious for extended periods, aware of the risk and the desperation surrounding him, yet even awareness offered little control. Pain and fatigue merged into a relentless continuum, punctuated by fleeting intervals of clarity and hope, as the rescue team continued to operate with extraordinary caution. Outside, the Utah landscape remained indifferent. Wind and weather moved on, untouched by the subterranean struggle. Within the cave, every creak, every drip, and every whisper of shifting stone underscored the precariousness of life, confined to such an unyielding environment. Eventually, the decision was made to cease extraction efforts. The cave was permanently sealed with Jones inside, a measure deemed necessary for safety and structural preservation. The corridor that had claimed him remained undisturbed, untouched by human hands save for the careful closure of its entrance. In the aftermath, the Nutty Putty tragedy prompted scrutiny of cave safety protocols, awareness campaigns for confined space navigation, and the preservation of knowledge about passages that offer both beauty and mortal danger. The incident became a profound lesson in the limits of rescue, the stubborn permanence of geological formations, and the delicate balance between exploration and mortality. In the days, weeks, and years that followed, the story of John Jones circulated among caving communities worldwide, an enduring cautionary tale. Maps were revised, warning signs posted, and the understanding of cave physiology deepened in response to the event. Yet for all the analysis and memorialization, the narrow passage that claimed Jones remained unchanged, a silent testament to the consequences of human curiosity, the unrelenting patience of limestone, and the precision required to survive where the earth itself offers no compromise. Each visit, each retelling, each educational seminar reinforced the awareness that the subterranean world has its own measures of time, patience, and consequence. The cave, in its unaltered state, continues to hold the story of struggle, hope, and human vulnerability. Explorers today approach Nutty Putty with a profound respect, guided by both technical understanding and an acknowledgement of the passage's lethal potential. The narrow shafts, sharp turns, and claustrophobic chambers are navigated with extreme caution, a living reminder that beneath the surface, the Earth remains an arbiter of both adventure and mortality. Every inch of limestone, every drop of water, and every echo of human presence carries the memory of John Jones, ensuring that the cave's lesson endures far beyond the fleeting life that ventured into its heart. Within the silent corridors of Nutty Putty, the limestone waits undisturbed, keeping its fatal secret in the memory of a man who dared to descend where the earth would not release him.